Buena.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here. I've been to many history conferences where I was worried that the panel would outnumber the audience. And I think at this point you outnumber me. So we're ahead of the game here. And I think I've got the screen share working. So I'm ready to get started. Last winter, I got a call from a very creative professor who wanted to combine his own specialty, which was early modern European history, with this class that he'd been assigned in the history of Minnesota. He'd intended to focus on French explorers and tie in anniversaries of the South Sea financial bubble in 1720 and the collapse of John Law's French Mississippi Company. After all, Minnesota is on the Mississippi. Then the COVID pandemic hit, and he decided to include also the anniversary of the Plague of Marseille in 1720-21 and the introduction of smallpox inoculation in London and in Boston in the same year. He asked me to speak about the medical history. My talk fell towards the end of the class. Okay, so this isn't happening. Wait a minute. John, it's not advancing. There we go. Okay, sorry. My talk fell towards the end of the class, and I wondered what might connect these very disparate events, which stretched from Istanbul to the Mississippi. And one day I realized what they had in common was imperial warfare and the Ottoman Empire. And in the end, I found a lot of unexpected connections among epidemic diseases, dynastic succession and failures, multi-confessionalism, transformations in the nature and meaning of borders and of nations, the growth of state bureaucracy, surveillance, and regulation. Increasing transportation and communication interacted with all of these events and created new worries about credit and credibility. Increased contact between and among multicultural states increased friction, but also gave rise to new opportunities to transmit disease concepts and descriptions from place to place. Today, I'm going to focus on just two of these themes: the role of chance multicultural personal connections in preventing smallpox, and the role of cultural separation in curbing the plague. It's possible that imperial warfares actually accidentally triggered both of these developments. I've always been intrigued by a comment made in 1981 in the European Demographic System by historian Michael Flynn. Flynn wrote that after the devastating plague of Marseille in 1720-21, further major plague outbreaks in Western Europe were prevented by a gigantic cordon sanitaire, a patrolled land border that stretched across the southern end of the Habsburg Empire and divided it from the Ottoman Empire. Established as a military frontier by the treaties of Karlowitz and Passarowitz in 1699 and 1719, it became a permanent land-based quarantine system known as the Pestfront in 1728, and it lasted until 1871. Was Flynn right? Many authors claim that land quarantines were pointless because the rats that carried plague don't respect edicts, borders, walls, or even armed soldiers. I'll return to this question later, but I want to start by summarizing 4 decades of international warfare. So those of you who have done early modern European history, bear with me. I'm assuming that most of you aren't completely up on the story of these 18th century wars. Unlike earlier conflicts, which were often civil wars centering on religion and ideology, these imperial wars involve shifting conflict alliances of whole kingdoms, fighting for control of territory and trade, that is, for material, not spiritual ends. Smallpox actually helped trigger these wars by felling so many European monarchs and heirs apparent. The wars themselves spread plague from east to west, but also resulted in the transference of smallpox inoculation. For nearly 40 years, From 1683 to 1721, 3 prolonged sets of conflicts ravaged southern, central, and northern Europe. 2 of them threatened the rickety Habsburg Empire, surrounded by her enemies. The third convulsed the Baltic. The first set of conflicts was between the Ottoman Turks and a shifting set of European allies, led by Habsburg Austria. In 1683, the Ottomans laid siege to Vienna itself, but the city barely held out. After the disastrous Battle of Zenta, they lost most of Hungary. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 established a formal border between the Ottoman Empire and European allies for the first time. Nearly 20 years later, the Turks again attacked Austria and again failed. This was the last time the Ottomans threatened Western Europe, but they retained much of Central Europe. Second, between these 2 Ottoman wars, the Austrians and an assortment of allies, including Britain, the Dutch Republic, and smaller states in Germany and Italy, fought the War of the Spanish Succession between 1701 and 1714 to prevent the French Bourbons from acquiring the entire Spanish Empire. Prolonged negotiations ended that worldwide war with the Peace of Utrecht. The War of the Quadruple Alliance followed 4 years later, but failed to overturn the status quo. After a series of smallpox deaths decimated Europe's ruling houses, Philip of Anjou, the French grandson of Louis XIV, did eventually become King of Spain. But the set of settlements known as the Peace of Utrecht curbed French aggression. Britain gained territory in America and access to transatlantic trade routes, including control of the slave trade. Meanwhile, the third conflict, the Great Northern War between 1700 and 1721, pitted the Swedish Empire, with half-hearted support from the Ottomans, against a coalition of northern states led by Russia. Initially, the Swedes, led by King Charles XII, prevailed, but in 1709, the Russians defeated him at Poltava in Ukraine, ultimately forcing a wounded Charles to seek refuge behind Ottoman lines in the town of Bender, which is now in Moldova. He remained in Ottoman territory for 5 years before returning to Sweden. One reason the Swedes collapsed was the plague. Hopscotching through the Baltic region, it killed hundreds of thousands of people in Poland, Hungary, Bavaria, and Bohemia. Despite local quarantines and other efforts to contain outbreaks, some towns lost more than half their population. Another factor was the harsh winter of 1708-9. Known in England as the Great Frost, it froze crops and caused famines all over Northern Europe, killing more than 500,000 people in France alone and crippling its war effort. Starvation spreads epidemics, both by reducing immunity and by forcing people to migrate in search of food. This disaster was compounded by the breakdown in trade and civic order caused by the fighting and the plague, and by huge armies which carried diseases with them and engaged in looting and torture whenever their pay or supplies ran short. Now I'm going to show you some maps of these wars and their outcomes. The maps are not quite in chronological order. When I was researching this, I found a video called The History of Europe Every Year, which I found absolutely mesmerizing, and I put the URL here in my slide for you. So map 1 shows Europe in 1682, just before the Siege of Vienna. As you can see with the arrows, nearly all of Hungary is part of the Ottoman Empire, which is the kind of greenish colored area on the map. And Russia is cut off from the Baltic by Sweden. Map 2 shows the same map in 1623 after the conflicts were temporarily settled. Austro-Hungary has ballooned at the expense of the Ottoman Empire and has also gained portions of Italy and the Netherlands. Russia has gained a much longed for gateway to the Baltic. Map 3 shows the full extent of the territory that the Ottoman Empire still held in 1720. It runs down the Red Sea on both sides, across northern Africa and into southern Russia, and also includes a lot of southern Europe and Eastern Europe. Now, map 4 shows the final extent of the military border that Flynn was talking about in the quotation that I showed you earlier. It was established in stages, beginning in Croatia in the 16th century. By 1718, following the Treaty of Passarowitz, the Austrians held most of Hungary, Slavonia, Serbia, and Wallachia, but at that date, the military border ran north of the area marked Banat and Transylvania with the blue arrows here and here. Maria Theresa later moved it to the other side of Transylvania, shown with the black arrows, and the whole military border is outlined with red slanting lines. Unlike the civil wars of the middle of the 17th century, these imperial wars were fueled by the greed of rulers by land, plunder, slaves, and access to international trade. Extending across 5 continents, they were fought largely by mercenaries. Warfare on this scale depended on the growing prosperity and interconnectedness of Europe. Trade itself created the ships, the roads, and efficient communication that enabled this global fighting. Between 1680 and 1720, the wars between the Ottoman and Habsburg empires gave rise not only to a new border, but to a new kind of border. Vague frontiers that had relied on the oversight of nearby fortresses and fealty to local landholders were replaced by well-defined territorial boundaries established by negotiations over a map and consistently patrolled on the ground. Together, trade, imperial warfare, and new borders produced expatriates, captives, and refugees prepared to fill a growing need for cross-cultural intelligencers and interpreters. Tolerating multiculturalism, however, also undermined religious conformity. Despite their best efforts to clamp down on nonconformists, Britain, Holland, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire, and even the Habsburg Empire, remained multi-confessional and multicultural states, as did their colonies in Africa and the Americas. In contrast to absolutist France, Russia, Portugal, and Spain, the Western nations, including Britain, Holland, Germany, Sweden, and Switzerland, retained a relatively free press and independent civic institutions. This affected their academic culture, their universities, scientific communication, and ultimately medical regulation, which was still controlled largely by universities, which in turn were set up as religious institutions. However, Italian states lost much of their independence during the early 18th century, damaging the Italian universities, Italian science, and Italian medicine, which had once been the most advanced in the world. The end of these wars, temporary end of these wars at least, coincided with a halt to major plague pandemics in Western Europe, but historians still debate the role of human intervention in this development. The long-established practice of maritime quarantine at ports of entry probably worked when it was strictly implemented. The last great plague epidemic in Marseille apparently resulted from a lapse in quarantine epidemics. The creation of a plague wall and military cordon that stretched across southern France may have minimized its inland spread. The enormous pest front across the southern Habsburg Empire followed in stages, starting in 1728. The eastward extension of the Habsburg boundary was largely due to one man, Prince Eugene or Eugen of Savoy. If Flynn was right, Eugene may also deserve credit for the retreat of plague from Western Europe. His goal in patrolling the border was to prevent Ottoman raiding, but the boundary he established became a cordon sanitaire lined with quarantine stations and guarded by settlers in exchange for land and tax exemptions. I'll return to this a little bit later. In the long term, maritime quarantines and land cordons estranged Western Europe from Southeast Europe and the Near East. Travelers crossing from east to west faced delays ranging from a minimum of 10 days to several months. The Earl of Sandwich fame traveled east in 1737, visiting Greece, Egypt, and Istanbul, and returned by ship. He nearly died on the way back, and his biographer comments that it's hard, quote, "It's hard to convey the astonishment contemporaries felt at this remarkable and dangerous voyage," unquote. In the short term, however, imperial warfare generated cross-cultural encounters. Wars always displace civilians and require espionage, trade, and negotiation. Commanders research the lands they are invading, and the people they occupy perforce learn about their invaders. The Ottomans, who absolutely despised Western languages, were especially reliant on go-betweens and court interpreters. These usually came from the cultural melting pots along the Adriatic coast and Eastern Mediterranean, where Venetians, Greeks, and Slavs all lived, traded, and competed. It was a series of accidental personal encounters involving these go-betweens that transmitted information about smallpox inoculation across a growing cultural divide. Now I'd like to take a look at some of the people caught up in these wars. I'll start with Prince Eugene of Savoy, who extended the military border across the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then turn to some of the people who helped transmit smallpox inoculation to Western Europe and beyond. They include Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, her surgeon Charles Maitland, Princess Caroline, and a whole chorus of fellows of the Royal Society. So let's start with Prince Eugene. He was an unlikely military hero. He was a sickly, scrawny, ugly child. His family destined him for the church because he thought he was good for nothing else. His volatile Italian mother was the childhood playmate of Louis XIV and possibly became his mistress. After she was implicated in a plot to poison the king and suspected of killing her husband, she fled France, leaving Eugene behind. Neglected, he joined an unruly group of cross-dressing noblemen, but he also studied mathematics and history, and he dreamt of military glory. In 1683, after Louis XIV had curtly refused his plea for an army commission, the 19-year-old Eugene stole away in disguise to the Austrian army and offered his sword to Leopold, the Holy Roman Emperor. You'll recall that 1683 was the time when the Turks had besieged Vienna, and Eugene joined the Allied forces racing to save Vienna from the siege. Vienna nearly fell just as the imperial army was arriving. He distinguished himself in the battle and was promoted. He continued to fight for Austria, first against Turkey and then against France, steadily climbing the ladder of promotion. By 1697, still in his 30s, Eugene had become the supreme commander of the imperial forces. He surprised and defeated a huge Turkish army at the Battle of Zenta, forcing the Turks to negotiate the landmark Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. When the War of the Spanish Succession broke out, he shared command of the Allied army with John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough. Working very closely together, they won a series of battles that ultimately led to the Peace of Utrecht. In 1716, the Turks invaded yet again, hoping to reclaim the lands that they'd lost at Karlowitz. Against heavy odds, Eugene won the Battle of Petrovaradin in 1716. It was this war that had led the British to dispatch Edward Wortley Montagu in 1716. With his wife, Lady Mary, he went first to Vienna to consult with Eugene and the Austrians, and then to Istanbul to negotiate with the Turks. To Montagu's great annoyance, after Eugene raised the siege of Belgrade in 1717, the Treaty of Passarowitz was finally settled in Vienna. It extended Habsburg territory nearly to the Black Sea, completing the military border that would last until 1871. As I noted earlier, during the Great Northern War, Charles XII of Sweden had lost to the Russians and fled to Ottoman territory in 1709. In 1713, he met with a physician named Emanuel Timony, or Timonius, near Istanbul. Charles, who'd lost his favorite sister to smallpox, had already heard of Timony from a mutual acquaintance, the Baron Aubry de la Mottrais, a French Huguenot refugee who was traveling through the East. At their meeting, Charles commissioned Timony to describe the method of inoculation practiced by the Christians in Ottoman Turkey. Timony came from a Greek family on the multi-ethnic island of Chios just off the coast of Turkey. His father and brother served as dragoman or interpreter to the Ottoman court. After graduating from Padua, Timony served as a physician to the expatriate community in Istanbul. His first patron there was the British ambassador, Lord Paget, who took him to England in 1703, where he acquired an honorary Oxford MD and became a Fellow of the Royal Society. Back in Turkey, he became physician to another British ambassador, Sir Robert Sutton. Timony's connection to the Royal Society paved the way for him to send a copy of his sketch of inoculation to a correspondent in England who shared it with the Royal Society. One version of this work was printed in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in 1714 and was later reprinted by English newspapers in 1721. Other versions appeared in Leipzig in 1714, Nuremberg in 1717, and Leiden in 1722. The Huguenot traveler Aubry de la Matre, who had introduced Timony to Charles, included a copy of Timony's essay in an appendix to his popular Voyages in Europe, Asia, and Africa, published in English, I believe, in 1727. Ambassador Robert Sutton apparently took a version to France, where the Regent's Council reviewed it. Meanwhile, Charles's own retinue took the original to Sweden in 1714, where it disappeared into archives at Uppsala University. In England, the Fellows of the Royal Society, who'd been hearing travelers' accounts of various methods of inoculation since the turn of the century, asked William Sherard, the British consul in Smyrna, to collect more information and send it to them. Timony's account was confirmed by a mutual friend, the Venetian consul in Smyrna, Jacob Pilarini. Pilarini, who came from a Venetian island of Kefalonia, also had a Padua MD. The footloose doctor, who'd served as a physician in Crete, Wallachia, Serbia, and Russia, wrote to Sherard that he himself had witnessed the occupation in a noble Greek family in Istanbul in 1701. Indeed, he may also have been Timony's source. The Montagues. When Edward Wortley Montagu arrived in Istanbul with his wife, Lady Mary, and his young son, Timony then became their family doctor. Their Scottish surgeon, Charles Maitland, had traveled overland with them. While Edward Montagu and Timony were absent at the abortive peace negotiations in the Turkish camp, Lady Mary persuaded Maitland to oversee the successful inoculation of their young son. This event was not unique among foreign diplomats. 2 children of Ambassador Robert Sutton's secretary had also been inoculated in Istanbul, and 4 children of the French consul were inoculated in Aleppo. The family's stay in Istanbul was unexpectedly cut short when the English government changed hands and recalled Montagu. In London, during the next smallpox epidemic, Lady Mary dragged Maitland from retirement and eventually persuaded him to inoculate her daughter. To her great annoyance, he insisted that 2 physicians act as witnesses. When the operation was a success, Lady Mary encouraged all of her well-born friends to follow her example. According to the first separate treatise on inoculation, published in English in July of 1721 by a Jewish refugee newly arrived from Portugal named Jacob de Castro Sarmento, Princess Caroline, the Queen's daughter-in-law, heard about inoculation, possibly from Mary herself, and then consulted a group of physicians. This group seems to have comprised Hans Sloane, David Hamilton, and John George Steigerthal, all fellows of both the Royal Society and the Royal College of Physicians. In June, the Crown sought and received a legal opinion that it was acceptable to pardon condemned prisoners in order to try inoculation. Maitland carried this out on August 19th in 1721 in front of Sloane, Steigerthal, and about 25 medical witnesses. The inoculation of the royal princesses followed after the prisoners had recovered. Historians disagree about Lady Mary's own role in the story. Genevieve Miller, author of the classic study on the introduction of inoculation, believed that Lady Mary's influence was negligible. Biographers of Lady Mary vehemently disagree and make her the heroine of the whole story. I doubt that we'll ever know. Meanwhile, in Boston, the Puritan minister Cotton Mather first heard of inoculation from his African slave, Onesimus, and later read Timoni's account in the Philosophical Transactions. Mather decided to try it the next time there was a smallpox epidemic. He carried out his plan in 1721 with a local medic, Zabdiel Boylston. Although his efforts were bitterly opposed by William Douglas, the only Boston practitioner who held an MD, and who referred to Mather as a certain credulous preacher, and also provoked the first incidents of terrorism that I know of in the English American colonies, Boston saw the first widespread inoculation campaign. Now I want to point out just how diverse the actors of this story have been. Although people often believe it was the English who introduced inoculation to Western Europe, in fact, except for Lady Mary, very few of the people I've mentioned were born in England. Of the trio of royal physicians, Steigerthal was German, Sloane was Irish, and Hamilton, like the Montague surgeon Charles Maitland, was a Scot. Claude Amiens, the surgeon who finally inoculated the princesses, was a bilingual Huguenot. Even the English royal family were recent arrivals. The king never learned English, and his German daughter-in-law avoided it. None of the attending physicians had a regular MD from an English university, although several of them had later received honorary degrees. This situation was common in England in the early 18th century. Although only Anglicans could graduate from an English university, the United Kingdom was a growing multilingual and multi-confessional state. Comparative liberty, success in the wars, trade, and a growing empire brought many foreigners to England. Huguenots, Jews, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Moravians, Quakers, Catholics, and many others often preferred to consult co-religionists who'd studied medicine overseas. The proliferation of nationalities and creeds undermined the power of the Anglican establishment to regulate education and medical practice. As medical education was an afterthought anyway in the English universities, even physicians with English degrees had often trained elsewhere. The London College of Physicians failed to control the profession or to fend off interlopers. In any case, its charter only extended for 7 miles around London. Elsewhere in Britain, medical practice was nearly unregulated. Its medical marketplace was ferociously competitive, and its press was unfettered. In this environment, even the craziest medical theories and the most dubious remedies could find devotees. Burgeoning trade, wealth, and an uncensored press also ensured that London became a communications hub. Unlike European academies, which were created, funded, and overseen by monarchs to serve their own ends, both the Royal Society and the Philosophical Transactions were financially independent, and the fellows were free to pursue their own interests. Dr. Hans Sloane, the chief medical sponsor of inoculation, was an Irish Presbyterian who had little formal medical training. A zealous botanist, he actively cultivated travelers, empirics, and other unorthodox practitioners, and was responsible for bringing many foreigners into the Royal Society. It was the free-for-all nature of English medicine that enabled inoculation, as Genevieve Miller pointed out by comparing England and France. Organizations created to regulate medical practice tend to be very conservative. After all, lives are at stake. The medical faculty of the University of Paris had much more power over medical practice in France than the College of Physicians exercised in England. Even though France had a much closer trading relationship with Turkey, and the French Regents' Council had actually discussed inoculation, the French faculty was able to squish it. A provisional acceptance of multicultural go-betweens was essential for the transfer of inoculation from Istanbul to the West, because a disease is an experience, not a thing that can be weighed and measured. It's very hard to differentiate among diseases that based solely on written accounts. Moreover, the early 18th century medics viewed every acute illness as a unique product of its particular environment and its interaction with a specific body. Like wine, every disease had its own terroir. As I explained in my book, the delineation of specific diseases evolved together with the adoption of contagionism. Most historians assume that the identity of smallpox was obvious and well understood. In fact, it had still not been clearly distinguished from chickenpox, measles, or other eruptive diseases. When Prince William, the heir to the English throne, died in 1700, his doctors argued about whether he had smallpox or strep throat. Many people still thought that smallpox came from an innate seed in every person that erupted when conditions were right. But if it was not necessarily contagious, then the illness that appeared in Aleppo might not be the same disease as the illness that broke out in London or Boston. If a child later contracted measles or chickenpox, it might be interpreted as a milder case of smallpox and used as evidence that inoculation did not really confer permanent immunity. Excuse me. Furthermore, language was slippery. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds of different local names for smallpox in different languages, and no certain way to translate these names into other languages. In fact, different cultures have entirely different ways of constructing a disease concept. So one culture's fever is another's bad wind, evil eye, flying gout, planetary emanations, overactive nerves, or chemical imbalance. Under these circumstances, how could anyone be sure that a child inoculated in one place would be protected in another? How could anyone know that a disease that roughly translated to smallpox among the Greeks in Istanbul was the same disease as the smallpox in English-speaking Boston? This assurance could only come from go-betweens who had seen the same diseases in different places and who understood not only different languages, but the ways in which different cultures constructed disease concepts. They alone could interpret an Eastern folk practice for a Western audience. Even then, it was hard to build credibility for a painful and dangerous innovation. The lack of medical regulation and the wild proliferation of cure-all pamphlets in England undermined faith in doctors. Thus, the acceptance of inoculation in England rested on the effort of the Royal Society to mount public spectacles and follow up by assembling as many eyewitness accounts from as many locations as possible. I've argued that multiculturalism was essential to the adoption of inoculation. Was it the opposite, cultural separation, that contained the spread of plague? Could the military border really have played an important role? People often claim that the plague of Marseille in 1720-21 was the last epidemic of plague in Europe. This is completely wrong. Perhaps this mistake comes from the habits of mind created by the military border itself. We still may forget that Turkey, the Balkans, and part of Russia are in Europe. All of them saw plague epidemics after 1720, as did Greece. Moscow experienced a crushing epidemic in 1770. There were also outbreaks in Hungary, in Malta, in Messina, in Greece, and in southern Italy after 1720. A strict quarantine in Noia, Puglia, snuffed out the last mainland outbreak of plague in Western Europe as late as 1815. But the plague of Marseille was the last major epidemic of plague to affect the mainland of Western Europe outside the Ottoman Empire. How we weigh the military border depends on our ideas about the epidemiology of plague itself. These have seen a radical transformation since just 1970. The plague bacillus is named Yersinia pestis for Alexander Yersin, who first identified it in Hong Kong in 1894. According to the traditional story, the bacilli infect rats. Fleas that bite the rats ingest the bacilli. They multiply and block the flea's digestive tract, and when blocked fleas bite a person, they regurgitate the bacilli into the wound. Thus, doctors saw plague as primarily a non-contagious disease that depended on transmission by rats. Doctors did concede that there are three types of plague: bubonic, when the bite causes a local swelling or bubo in the closest lymph node to the bite; septicemic, when the bacteria invade the blood vessels and kill the victim very quickly; and pneumonic, when someone coughs and bacteria are inhaled into the lungs. But they viewed pneumonic plague as contagious but very rare. Although we now know that the disease is very old, the first recorded pandemic was the plague of Justinian in the middle of the 6th century CE. Mongols brought a second pandemic to Europe, triggering a major outbreak there in 1348 that persisted through the 18th century. A third pandemic originated in China in the mid-19th century, spread around the world, and is still with us. Starting in 1970, historians began debating about whether the first two recorded pandemics were really caused by the same bacterium that Yersin identified during the third pandemic. The written descriptions are not definitive, and some authors argued that the recorded symptoms don't match the symptoms usually associated with Y. pestis. Others noted that the epidemiology and sequence of transmission from place to place across Europe doesn't match the behavior of rats. For example, rats can't survive in the cold climate of Northern Europe, yet the Baltic saw terrible epidemics during a period of exceptionally cold weather during the Great Northern War. All of that was overturned by the advent of DNA analysis. Scientists began to dig up bodies from mass burials and extract material from inside their molars, which can sometimes preserve the DNA of this fatal disease. It seemed as if science would settle the debate quickly when French researchers found evidence of Y. pestis in bodies from Marseille and from earlier plague burials. But then another group of archaeologists failed to find it in plague burials from 14th century London and from Copenhagen from the Great Northern War. A series of articles published by a team led by Mark Ackman and from 1999 to 2004 settled that debate. They found that all three pandemics were due to Y. pestis and identified three different strains, which they named Antiqua, Medievalis, and Orientalis. The technique has now become so sophisticated that researchers have been able to determine when smaller mutations occurred. This creates a sort of a family tree for different strains or clades of Y. pestis that can also help establish a timeline. Researchers have now shown that the sequence of rat to rat flea to human plague is oversimplified. Plague reservoirs persist in mammals, and especially in ground-dwelling mammals that live in colonies, such as prairie dogs and marmots. This means it's probably impossible to eradicate it completely, especially in areas such as Central Asia, which has large colonies of these animals. I might add also in Colorado. Plague can be carried by a wide range of animals, including gerbils, camels, and cats. Researchers have also found that rat fleas are not the only insects that can transmit the plague. Ticks, human fleas, and even human head and body lice may also spread it. That means that transmission patterns may sometimes look like those found in a contagious disease. People can carry plague parasites from place to place in their clothes, their hair, or their bodies. They can also carry the disease in goods, especially furs and grains. This explains plague outbreaks in the frozen north, where there were no rats, and suggests that intercepting people and certain merchandise can facilitate prevention even if the rats can slip through. These findings led to new ideas about how plague might have spread. According to one theory, it was carried into Europe by camel trains along the Silk Road. Another theory claimed it was transported through the Baltic by the trade in furs and hides. A third theory held that it has survived among alpine mammals within Europe and persisted there in between outbreaks. Just this fall, Miriam Galil and a team at the University of Oslo published an article stating that they sequenced one 14th century and 6 17th century genomes from graves in Italy and from 18th century burials in Chechnya and Sweden. After combining their new results from earlier analysis, they conclude that earlier 18th century epidemics probably spread into Europe from the South Caucasus. They claim that Western and Southern Asia and the area around the Black Sea, the areas cut off by the pest front or the Habsburg military border, have served as the origin of European pandemics throughout history. An article by Monica Green, an important article in the December American Historical Review, agrees. So now the Flynn thesis about the role of the military border is beginning to look a little better. Thank you very much. Amanda, I think you're, there we go. I think you're muted.
Amanda, you're muted.
Thank you, Margaret.
You're still muted, Amanda. It's if you hover down at the bottom, you'll see a button that says at the bottom left that has a microphone shape.
You can just
type
hold
Alt,
down,
type
you can
Alt
hold down your
A.
space bar also. Just hold down your space bar.
Oh, really? Boy, some of these people are really very.
Isn't technology fun? So we have a few minutes for questions. If people want to unmute and add them, or maybe just put them in the chat.
Well, I wanted to say thank you. That was really interesting. And I had literally no clue about half the stuff. I've even done some reading on European and Western European military history, and that was just all new to me. Hi, Kitty.
A lot of it, to be honest, a lot of it was new to me too. You know, as a British historian, when I read about these wars on the continent and peace treaties and so on, I tend to just skip over them because that wasn't what I was working on, I thought. So I had to go back and revisit a lot of my, even my high school history. Hello, Ernie.
Hi, how are you, Margaret? That was marvelous. And it really stimulated a lot of thoughts and queries. And one, this is out of left field, but something was said about multiculturalism. You know, the question why the West has been raised so frequently. And it struck me as you were talking, you showed that slide of the origins of others, of people, for example, in the FRS, the permeable boundaries, so to speak, particularly in Britain and in the Netherlands, so to speak, and that tolerance of other cultures suggested that as opposed to, say, other cultures, that may have been a very significant factor at that particular time.
I feel it, yeah, I feel it was. It certainly wasn't something that any of them thought was a good idea. Trumpists were more popular, I think, than liberals in Western Europe in this period. But if you have an empire or you're waging a war, it kind of literally comes with the territory. If you're ruling over many different countries, it's impossible then to impose a strict religious orthodoxy.
Right. And then the other thought, there is the suggestion that one of the reasons why vaccination that Jenner introduced decades later was so immediately successful was this previous practice of variolation, which had been introduced and been around for decades, maybe 50 to 80 decades. And the concern, of course, was that, and had been noted, you could start an epidemic of smallpox from variolation. And of course, occasionally people died if they had eczema or were immunologically compromised. And however, Benjamin Franklin writes somewhere that he lost a fine son because he didn't variolate him. You know, so there were these tensions on both sides. So it cast a very long shadow. Anyhow, I really
Yeah, I mean, you know, we talk about vaccine hesitancy now because there's one possible complication in a million. Variolation was a horrible practice. I mean, it was brutal. It made people really sick for a long time, and it carried a fairly high risk of dying. The only thing that could be said for it was that the alternative was possibly worse.
And it's said that Washington's most important decision at Valley Forge was to variolate his soldiers. There were rumors the British were going to attempt to use germ warfare with, you know, variant smallpox impregnated material. Anyhow, well, thank you again. That was marvelous.
Oh, it was a lot of fun to work on. Kind of expanded my own horizons. So I was really pleased to be asked to do this.
That's great.
So
thank you very much. I'm back. I completely lost the meeting screen, so I couldn't. I had no functionality whatsoever. So apologies for that. We've got a question here from Outsider Art, but I don't know who Outsider Art actually is. Maybe you could ask your question, and then you could tell us who you are as well. You need to unmute yourself.
So I'm going to go back while we're waiting. I'm going to go back and share my screen and show you if I can, and show you a picture I showed you earlier of the, let's see, how do I go back here? Anybody tell me how to go back? I had a picture of
the back arrow key on your keyboard might work through the.
Yeah, it's not working.
Oh. Well, that was my idea.
If I can pull it up, I'll show you the picture of the inoculation scar from one of my slides. There was an illustration of what it looked like, and it's a big sore. It's not just this little thing. And doctors, it started as a folk practice, you know, by old Greek women in particular. The Muslims in the Istanbul and the Ottoman Empire did not practice inoculation as far as we can tell. It was an expatriate or a practice from people who lived in the area but were Greek, primarily Greek speaking. And the women who did it, I think, used mostly their sewing needles. Later on, the British doctors tended to use scalpels and make much deeper wounds. And their patients, as a result, got sicker. Because we think one of the things that makes inoculation work when, like, inoculation for measles and other diseases turned out not to work, is temperature. You introduce a little bit of the virus to a part of the body that's cooler than your bloodstream. And it gives your body a chance to see it before it invades the rest of your body. So doing a tiny scratch on the outer part of the skin was a much safer and more effective practice than what English doctors did later, which was make fairly deep wounds with a scalpel.
Margaret, Joan,
Yeah.
who's actually an epidemiologist, she knows her stuff. She's asked, why was variation, she said, so traumatic compared to the procedure many of us experienced as children?
Okay, so variolation is done with smallpox. You take a person, a child who has ideally a good case, a mild case of smallpox, and you take a little pus from one of the pustules on their skin and you prick somebody else with that. Vaccination comes from the word for cow, vaca, and is actually brought in by, not by Edward Jenner, he popularized it probably by a friend of his named Justy. But they were members of the same medical club, and they noticed that milkmaids who got cowpox tended to be immune to smallpox and so had unmarked skin. Everybody who got smallpox ended up with scars, usually on their face. And so cowpox, which is probably related to smallpox way back, it provides immunity to smallpox, but is not as severe a disease. And then later, when Pasteur was working on rabies, he discovered that he could do something similar and attenuate the rabies virus by drying it out and multiple iterations, so that it was enough so that your body could recognize rabies, but not enough to actually give it to you. And that's a process that works particularly well with viruses. It doesn't really work for bacteria at this point. And that's what they've been trying to do with COVID, is just come up with enough of the virus so that your body can recognize its signature without actually making you sick. So the whole process by which we now immunize people for coronavirus really began in the 1720s with the discovery or with the introduction of inoculation into the West, although it had been practiced unpublished by peoples in various parts of the world for a long time, and by the Chinese in particular extensively, using a different method from the 17th century.
Thank you. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yes.
Do we have any more questions? More questions? Okay, I have a question, because at the moment, obviously, we're living through a pandemic. The other outbreaks, of course, were quite localized in a way, though my own work on the life in Marseille, which was 19th century, I'm looking at, but we did have obviously the Great Plague in the 18th century. I'm just wondering about the cultural differences that we're seeing now. Did you see, have you had an idea of cultural differences? I mean, for instance, at the moment, the French are very unhappy about vaccines. I think our take-up in England has been much higher. I mean, we're obviously 200 years later, we're much more used to the idea of vaccination. We're not that frightened of it, but culturally, different societies have a very, very different response. Did you pick up that back in the period that you're talking about?
Yeah, well, I see both. One thing that fascinates me is when you have a very severe contagious disease, human nature tends to be pretty much the first response tends to be the same everywhere, which is to deny it. Mm-hmm. And I have a feeling that one of the reasons that international diplomacy developed was out of the need to have spies in foreign cities to be sure that they were in fact not experiencing an outbreak of a lethal disease. The Renaissance cities, Italian cities, put a ton of effort into doing this and corresponding with their diplomats all over. And of course, a lot of the story of inoculation, there are a lot of diplomats involved that we don't really think about the role that they played, because everybody's hung up over whether Lady Mary was important or not. But I've talked about at least 3 ambassadors and a couple of consuls as well here. So there's the denial phase, you know, and then there's the point where the news leaks out and other countries or other territories start closing their borders. There's a certain amount of othering that goes on. That's my, sorry, that's my egg timer, my favorite technical device here. But the attitude towards prevention, yeah, there are 5 stages of vaccination denial for sure. I'd say there are five stages of disease denial, of especially when a disease is lethal. There's a stage where people say, oh, it's not serious. It's not really the plague. It's some other disease. It's a fever, it's typhus, whatever. The stages of prevention are really different though. There's a lot of cultural variation in how people then choose to cope with this fact once they've started acknowledging it.
Mhm.
There's at this point pretty good literature on the Muslim response to plague. And my friends who've spoken on this have pointed out that one reason is not just Muslim fatalism, although that is there. You know, they did not believe in either leaving town or taking active measures to quarantine people. But on the other hand, they also lived in a place where plague was endemic because it is coming from these animal colonies, and it sweeps through a lot of these eastern cities in the Levant pretty much annually. And so the same measures that the West was able to take to prevent it from being brought in would not have been effective in those territories.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, there's a new book on inoculation, and she does a pretty thorough analysis of the early stages by which various European countries accepted variolation. And she talks about Russia, for example, and Sweden and other European countries, and whether and when it was introduced. She feels that the leadership of a royal family or of other celebrities, you might say, was really very important in promoting acceptance of the practice.
If I may,
Bernie?
what
Yep.
I find fascinating is the role of Onesimus in Boston, the slave from North Africa. So it must have been transmitted to, I don't think we know what area he was from in just somewhere in North Africa.
The thinking is Tripoli.
Tripoli. Okay,
Mhm.
so, and if the Muslims were not practicing it, perhaps apparently he reported it was widespread in his community or in his origin. So, perhaps from the Greeks or it transmitted by that source. And of course, the other interesting thing is that the Chinese method, well, Joseph Needham claims that actually the Turkish method, or the method the Greeks used, was really derived from the Chinese method, but I think he's wrong. I mean, I think it's completely independent because the Chinese used to take flakes from nostrils. They would put little knitting needles, so to speak, up, well, the equivalent thereof, up into the, get flakes, crusting flakes from the nose.
They blow it up a straw.
Is that what it was, a straw?
Yeah.
And then put it in somebody else's nostrils, which was a completely different practice. Although, you know if that was more or less lethal than the inoculation? I don't know.
Well, what happened was Richard Mead, who I didn't have time to talk about in this talk, when they experimented with the Newgate prisoners, they experimented with one who had the insufflation, the nasal technique, and that person got much sicker
Really?
than everybody else. So, but the woman I just mentioned, her name is Alicia Grant, and the book is called The Globalization of Variolation, The Overlooked Origins of Immunity for Smallpox in the 18th Century, London, 2019. I don't agree with everything she has to say, but it's really worth a look if you're interested in that book, in the story. She says, well, the Chinese allowed the matter to dry before they tried to send it up somebody's nostril. And that drying process then attenuated enough so that people didn't get terribly sick, and it was much less harmful than inoculation. And that's why the Chinese emperor was able to like do the whole army. The problem is that we have very little in the way of written material. We know that there was smallpox in Africa, but we don't have records of what was happening. We have a few, but very little about where it was breaking out and what the African civilizations were trying to do to control it. And our own written records, as I said, it's really hard to diagnose a disease of any kind from a written record, especially a record made by a culture that has a different understanding of what disease is and where it comes from. So even our own understanding of these diseases has really changed a lot since we've been able to do the DNA analysis and uncover their relationships with each other and their history. It's like doing a language. If you see that different places in the world have a slightly different accent or vocabulary, you can trace that back and develop a picture also of the chronology by which that language has changed, and not just the change itself. So a lot of people talk about the germ theory of disease, and I like to remind them that that's modern and we're postmodern now. What we do is with genetic analysis, with genomes, is no longer germ theory. It's post-germ theory. We talk about COVID variants. It's not just a thing anymore. It's a collection of variants. And the same is true with many of our diseases. We've been able to take that next step back into the virus, which people only were able to visualize the virus, I think, in the 20th century. And the bacteria then in the 19th century. So.
Well, thank you so much. Are there any more questions? I think we've got time for one more. No?
Have I silenced everybody?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to unmute everybody. I don't think. No, if everybody would like to unmute themselves, I'd like to say a big thank you to Margaret for a fascinating talk. And so can we all show our appreciation, please?
Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. That was lovely.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you,
My
Margaret.
cat appreciates it too.
Thank you very
Do
much.
I get a meow?
That was
You had a purr.
interesting. So
Oh.
much food for thought.
That was
I'd like
great.
just to a little plug, our next NCIS event is going to be in May. Dr. Gloria Montebuno Salla, who's received an NCIS research grant last year. She'll be talking about her research that we helped to fund. It's on survivors of Hiroshima who are currently living in the States. And you'll find details on the resources page on the NCIS website. So,
Amanda, may I pop in with one last question?
sure.
Absolutely.
Margaret? Okay, Margaret.
And
I
you have
just
my
want-
email if you want to email it too.
No, I want everyone to hear your answer. This is not necessarily about the disease, but just do you want to say a couple of words about your relationship with NCIS and the value of NCIS in the world of knowledge and study and thought and all of the partner groups as well?
Without Margaret,
The idea of independent scholarship.
Well, maybe Joanne would like to take that one. Joanne and I and Georgia Wright formed a little group at the San Diego Independent Scholars Conference many, many years ago. There was a newsletter for independent scholars, and the person who wrote the newsletter died. It had been circulating among the groups by mimeograph, I think. And after he died, the San Diego Independent Scholars called a conference, and we went, and we kind of undermined the conference, or we had a little plot.
Hijacked
The conference because we wanted to start a national group. And there was a lot of skepticism about whether a national group was sustainable. And Joanne actually did a lot of the hard work involved in like creating a directory and maintaining a membership list and all of that, which all had to be done by hand, of course, in those days. And then Georgia volunteered to create a newsletter, the Independent Scholar, which was then, I think, mimeographed or Xeroxed and mailed to all the groups. And
I think
I don't even, yeah.
Yep.
I helped kind of develop the organizational structure, I think. I don't really remember what I did. I was pregnant at the time, I think, so my memory of that period isn't too good. And I wrote a little article on a national organization. So I don't feel I really did most of the work involved.
And
I
about
just-
independent
something
scholarship as a lifestyle.
The
Yeah.
Well, my mother was an independent. My mother had a Ph.D. from Radcliffe immediately post-war, like 48. And she moved to a small university town with her husband and could not get hired because of nepotism rules. And then when they eventually moved to DC, nobody would hire her because she was a woman. And she finally got a job because she was filling in for a part-time teacher who got pregnant. And she was one of a whole group of women, including Hannah Gray, Natalie Davis, a whole bunch of women who went on to be extremely successful in that post-war period, who were very poorly treated when they were first starting out. She taught part-time for a long time. They finally offered her a full-time job, which she declined because she also had 3 children. She went on to a full-time job at Michigan, an endowed chair. But I watched her have a nervous breakdown because having a family and writing a big book and working on articles and teaching was so overwhelming. She did come, she survived it, came through much stronger. But I just felt that there should be other options for women who didn't want to try and live that way. And for men who didn't want to live that way as well, who had other jobs, for example, other careers, who wanted to stay home with their children, who were emeriti. And so that's how I became involved. Oh, my email address. Okay, you can find me. Sure, I'll type it into the chat. How's that?
While you're doing that. Oh.
Yeah, please, Joanne, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that originally the name National Coalition of Independent Scholars derives from the fact that there were a number of
groups.
Yes.
of local groups, and we imagined originally that was going to be its development. So that has really changed so much. I guess you don't want to change the name, but
Well,
we drew a lot.
have-
We drew a lot of strength from the local groups.
Yeah, so it was the independent scholar groups that came first, and
Yes.
we evolved as a coalition of those groups and have then developed since. We're now international, but we have a problem with renaming NCIS because, for a start, if you said International Coalition of Independent Scholars, it comes out as ISIS. So
Oh dear.
in today's climate, we have had many hours of board discussion over this.
Yeah.
So, it's complicated, but we are so honored to have 2 of our founding mothers with us and still active and contributing brilliantly to the field. So thank you
Been a
both.
pleasure. Been a pleasure.
Donna.
I want to say thank you to Amanda, who has really done a lot to strengthen
Yes.
NSYS. It's really been a very impressive achievement.
Well, it's a team effort. I have to stress
Yeah,
that.
but convening a team is not always easy, as I know from from a
You've
lot
heard
of
in cats.
experience.
No, it's a great team. We're very fortunate. We have some fantastic people. So
I just wanted to pop in too and say that we're still very, very much reliant and related to our partner groups.
mhm.
And in fact, we're going to be having a meeting of the partner group leaders next month. But in addition, we have gained many members from all over the world who absolutely have no partners, let alone a partner group, and who feel very isolated, and who
Yeah.
who come directly into NSYS because they don't have the partner group experience. So in a way, it's the balance of both. I mean, we're happy to have both.
Yeah, I actually I joined the Northwest Independent Scholars after they'd been founded, and I was recruited
Mhm.
by the person who founded it. And I once asked him why he started the group, and he said, I wanted somebody to talk to.
Yeah.
Mm.
And that's kind of why I joined. I wanted
Yeah.
somebody to talk to. I will say that from my research that two things that might apply to NSYS are, first of all, that multiculturalism is good.
Mhm.
And or can produce good things. It can spread disease, but it can also produce very good things.
Not on Zoom.
And second, that established institutions can protect people, but they can also be a bit of a dead hand on innovation.
Yep. Well, I'm glad to say that we're all moving forward. We have a wider community of independent scholars now than I think we ever have done. And independent scholarship is a thing. So
Yes.
we don't feel devalued or anything. It's a valid career choice. So thank you very much, everybody, and particularly
Thank you.
Margaret. It was a fantastic
thank you.
lecture. So thank you very much, and hope to see you again next time. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
See you later. So nice to see you again, Joanne.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. I want to see the cat.
Thank you, Amanda. This was fun.
Thank you.
Thank you. It
Thanks a
was,
lot.
wasn't it? I like Gary's cat as well.
I want to see the cat. Yes, I know. I miss my cat. Okay.
Oh,
Bye.
thank you. Bye, folks.
Thank you.